All right, welcome to another episode of Fourth Awakening. Today we're going to be talking about the second episode of the first season of Black Mirror, 15 Million Merits. So, Scott, you want to kick us off, give us a little bit of background for the story for this one?
Sure thing. Just to top it off, just straight from the bat, like this is a completely different world from National Anthem. National Anthem is kind of like set more in kind of like a realistic world where like something like that could actually happen. This one we're just kind of just thrown in, just kind of heads deep into something that we don't even know. So we're kind of it's essentially it revolves around people pretty much biking on these like bikes essentially to earn these merits, which they then use to pretty much pay for different things throughout like their day-to-day life, such as like toothpaste, food, like watching different videos or even avatars. And so it's a completely different side of the coin versus National Anthem. And some people even say that this episode is almost like the quintessential like Black Mirror episode, or at least like for some people to get into to like kind of understand the series.
Right, yeah, I think in many respects this is the like standard episode. Not to say that it's the best episode, but it's very much so the first, I should say, just quintessential. Like it defines the series of Black Mirror itself, and we're seeing many of the themes. I think we saw a lot of the themes that we saw in the first episode, the relationship between technology and society. But this time it's shifting just into this kind of fictional, imaginary world. I mean, they're literally powering bikes as currency. That seems very unrealistic, something that would never happen. But I think there's like an interesting metaphor there, which I'd like to talk to you about, which is that, you know, we're just born, right? Like in the same way that in our lives, we're just born into a society, into a world, no explanation, right? Suddenly we're just, we're crawling around and suddenly, we're, moving little toy trains on tracks or whatever and playing around. We're doing things and then we have to do a job. In the same way that, we were thrown into this episode, thrown into this series, and then they're pedaling bikes, no real explanation given for why the system is the way that it is, but it does seem very rigid. What do you think about that? Is there any kind of connection there? Because I mean, that's how all the episodes of Black Mirror seem to be, right?
Yeah, well, that is one of the more interesting things about Black Mirror is that no episode is exactly the same as the last one. And like you do, as you do start to watch the series more and more, you do sort of kind of like see this almost kind of like interconnectivity between the episodes through like either like Easter eggs or common themes or even like songs, for example, which were actually introduced in this episode through the song "Anyone." Later on for the talent show Hot Shot, but for this one especially, I think it's also there's not too much to kind of grasp upon. Like the last one's like, oh, it's kind of like almost like modern day Britain. There's like a prime minister, there's social media, all this stuff. This one is just like it's almost just like a futurist society, which is like, okay, like why are these people powering these bikes? Like, is there any meaning behind this? Like, what's going on? So it raises a little bit more questions, but at the same time, it also creates a lot more intrigue and curiosity as well.
Right. And there's kind of this weird self justifying nature of the system, which is that, when Abby was on the stage trying to, they were asking her whether or not she was going to basically do porn to, go on, what was it, Wraith Babes or whatever it was to make money or make merits or whatever in the future. One of the ways that they were guilt tripping her was saying that the lights that were shining on her were powered by the bikes.
Hmm.
And so by doing that, she was basically wasting other people's time, wasting other people's merits, not just the people watching, but the people who are, using the energy, using the merits to power those lights. So there's a weird sort of self-perpetuating nature of the system to its very core, right? I mean, we saw, later in the episode, obviously there were other instances of that, but I just thought, I mean, that particular moment like really stood out to me.
Yeah, the entire like layout of the actual like I guess you could say structure or like living quarters or whatever is like cyclical. It's like people on the bikes are watching Hotshot, and then people get on Hotshot and they're there because the people on the bikes are powering the stage lights, and like it just kind of keeps going around like the bikes, for example. So that could be, for example, why we're introduced to the main character being of why he is just kind of like so like apathetic at the beginning. It's just because he's just feel like he's like stuck in this endless cycle that's just like never going to end.
Literally cycling, right? He's literally cycling on a bike and he's on an endless cycle and he can't do
Yeah.
anything. Right. I mean, it's exactly that. And then going into what is in many respects the climax of the particular sort of narrative arc, we see Bing going up and giving that dramatic speech with the glass shard pointed to him, the very glass shard which he broke, when he got when he threw a complete tantrum trying to cover the ad, breaking the screen or whatever.
Mm.
So it's, sort of symbolizes a bit of that anger, like giving a dramatic speech about how upset he is with the system, and then he gets the opportunity to, at the end we saw use that glass shard, give speeches, give anger, sort of drive in, that upset nature, thereby perpetuating the system.
Yeah, I mean, we even see that at the very end. Like, one of the characters is like scrolling through the different avatar like attachments and stuff, and like one of the accessories that's a thing right now is like Bing's glass shard.
Right. And so the very like outrage and upset, how upset he is at the system just gets sucked right into the system. So
Sucked
it's like,
back into the
right,
system.
it's completely, it's really, really interesting. So, I mean, what else though, like really, did anything in particular like really stand out to you in the show besides that point, or?
Yeah, so one thing that so this is about like the second time I've watched this episode in particular. One thing that I really paid more attention to this time is there's one thing that we're introduced to that Abby is able to do, which is almost kind of like a form of like origami, for example. And so she actually does it. I think it's either it's almost kind of like the paper piece that you get like the apple from, or from like the vending machine, but
Mhm.
she actually turns the apple into almost kind of like a penguin that like folds up, and then like you can like make him stand up when you unfold it or whatever. And she like puts it on her treadmill, but then like one of like the janitor guys just comes up and just like sweeps it off because it's like trash or whatever. But later on in that same episode, Bing's talking about how like some of like the most real things are like free and beautiful, and how like you can't just buy them. They just are, for example. And I think we see that not only with, for example, was it Allie's voice? I believe that's her name. Abby, sorry,
Yeah,
Abby.
Abby, yeah.
Yeah, so Abby's voice, like this amazing singing voice that is like clearly good compared to like the rest of the hotshot contestants, but is therefore just like completely just overlooked because of her looks, and they try to just get her into that like through the Wraith Babes and stuff. So we clearly see that with just her voice there, but we also see it just like just simple act of like just even making the penguin, because like what does he talk about in that speech? He talks about like we keep getting all these merits to buy like invisible stuff, like different like like plugins for like our smart mirrors, or like new hats for our avatars which aren't even real. And so he's just like talking about how like the entire like structure is set up to like make to give people merits, for people to spend merits on things that don't even exist.
Right.
And
And
just kind of like why.
and the craziest part is those particular origami things, like you were pointing out, they get thrown away basically at the end of every day. So it's like this idea that the truly valuable things aren't things that last. I mean, it seems like there's this long thought trend. I mean, you go into Western philosophy, Plato or whatever, but basically everyone seems to think that like true and good things are things that are also eternal. But that really seems to be challenged. That idea is really challenged in this episode, saying that like no, the really really valuable things are the things that don't last because they are real, and ironically the things that do last, those avatars, are not real,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I think there's even a quote. I believe I heard it from Alan Watts, who's kind of like an old school kind of Eastern philosopher from like the 70s or 80s period. But there's especially a concept of like either like more like Eastern thought or like Buddhism, of like the more permanent a thing is, the less real it tends to be.
Mm,
So like think of like a stone versus like a flower, like a mountain compared to like a tree or something like that. Like if
interesting.
something is growing, it has the capacity to die, versus if something just like is and is just static, then like yeah, it's gonna last a while, but it has like no like life force. There's no evolving emotion to it as much.
Mm. Yeah, and well, and the other thing that I found really interesting in this show is just, me, I've been doing some videos like about political commentary and stuff like that, on YouTube, and sometimes it does feel like, you're just making outrage into a machine, and that machine is just, sort of spitting it out as a kind of product for people to consume and enjoy, when, you are trying to make a legitimate kind of criticism of society, but there's a thought there that if you actually did make a legitimate criticism of society, then you wouldn't get any merits for it. You wouldn't get any. I mean, what does it really make? What does it really matter? And so the only way then to actually make a criticism that people hear, people listen to, is to just turn it into a commodity, which by necessity, as sort of suggested in that show, doesn't really do anything. It doesn't actually change the system, right? Because by definition, commodities are a function of the system.
Yeah. Do you think there's any I'm trying to think here. Do you think there's any like weight to that? Like, is there a way, like for example, like 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 for example, like what if there was a way for them to almost like, or, sorry, let me go back. All right. Do you think that's also something that we're trying to see in the episode too? It's like even like this entire world is almost kind of like structured in a way to try and make the real things commodities. For example, like just with like the glass shard, or like even like turning Abby's voice and like completely turning it into just like a twisted perversion into getting her into porn. Like, do you think that's like almost like what we're seeing through like the structure of like like this like all the bicycles of just like this churning machine of like turning the real into commodities? Do you think that's almost like maybe possibly a critique upon capitalism or something along those lines?
Very possibly. I mean, it seems to be a broader critique than just like a critique on capitalism. I mean, it could be. I mean, you could certainly turn it into a critique of capitalism if you
Yeah.
wanted it to. But it's certainly, I think that it's a story of just how we live our lives in general. So maybe it's a story of capitalism, right? Like maybe we could get out of this one day. But that's not like it. I mean, we don't really see like an edge to the system. It's just we only see things inside of the system. Even at the end, when Bing is standing out looking over these trees, you notice he's still looking at screens, right? He's
Hmm.
still looking at screens. And so as
I
as
think that's the question though, because like, are they actually windows or are they screens? Like, what makes points out to you that they might be screens perchance versus actual windows?
I mean, they definitely look like screens. I mean, you could tell. Like, I mean, and at the end, I mean, Bing didn't look happy. I mean, he looked like he was still. He had it was. I mean, I think you pointed out this to me, but it was just his apathetic self. He's reverted to his apathetic self. He's just making more merits now.
Yeah, and
Now he can just pour his orange juice.
yeah,
You
and I
know.
did notice this turnaround too. I don't know if I noticed this the first time I watched it, but like on the same table where he has like this little case to like hold the glass shard, of which he's pretty much making his living now. He also has like a very nice statue of like a wooden penguin, but at the
Mm,
same time, it doesn't like give as much emotion to the one that Abby made for him. Of like the origami penguin that she made
right.
just.
And well, and that's actually interesting because what we were talking about earlier is this is wooden, so it presumably he can keep this one, right?
Hmm.
Whereas the origami one, you know, it gets thrown away, right?
Yeah, it's viewed as trash essentially.
Right. So there's kind of something interesting there as well.
I think I also noticed something else for this turnaround too. There also even seems to almost be a little bit more of like a hierarchy just among like the bikers and stuff. So like for example, like if you're not able to get fit enough to keep on biking, you essentially go a tier down, which seems to be, I think they call them like the lemons or whatever. At least that's what one guy calls them. But it's essentially like basically like janitors and like yellow like
Right.
suits. But I noticed even this time around that there's actually like even like a game that they play of like where they're killing the janitors and almost kind of like a shooter style game. Do you think there's anything to that per
Right.
se?
Yeah, I mean that's super super interesting and I'm glad you had pointed that out to me, which is literally in the games they're killing janitors. So it's kind of self-perpetuating that hierarchy. So in the same way that the judges on Hot Shot look down on bike riders, also the average bike rider, I mean the average sort of typical bike rider was, sort of the was just sort of represented by this, the guy who was next to him, always biking next to Bing, who was kind of a bit crass, a bit just laughing, looked kind of like an idiot. Was sort of presented that way. Was always making fun of him. Always making fun of the lemons, always insulting him. And so
Yeah,
in that sense,
throwing trash on the floor and be like, "Oh, you missed a bit there," or
right?
whatever.
Yeah, and so there's this idea there that these people were just insulted, and by insulting them and like giving them as entertainment for you to enjoy and consume while you're riding the bike, it perpetuates and makes it so that then the bike riders themselves are stuck bike riding more.
Yeah.
So
Do
there's
you
kind
think
of an interesting.
it maybe adds like a twisted form of motivation too? So like not only like the more they bike, like do they get more merits, but also like if they keep biking or at least like staying healthy or like don't put, it's like motivation for them not to become a lemon in a way too. Do you think that possibly has any weight to it as well?
Yeah, I mean, because they insult them, so they wouldn't want to be insulted that way for sure. I mean, there's
Yeah.
also an interesting dynamic where, obviously there's still a kind of stigma. I don't know if that's quite the. Well, actually, let me ask you: do you think that there's still a kind of stigma about porn in this society? Because Abby was, I couldn't tell if people were looking down on her for making that choice or not, or whether, like, what did you think about that?
Well, it's it's definitely kind of funny to see just through like how it's presented through like Bing's perspective, because like for the most part it tends to be just like super like ad spam. It's just like Wraith girls, the hottest babes ever, and it's like
Right.
it's like popping up. I think that's actually one of the funniest parts in the episode. It's like he's actually trying to have like this genuine conversation with Abby in the bathroom at one point, and he's like, and then and then the Wraith babes ad pops up. It's like, hey, regular user, new Wraith babes video.
Though ironically, it kind of helped because she laughed about it. So
Oh my
you
gosh.
could make that argument, but
Yeah. Well, that's what's particularly interesting too of like these different ads that we start to see, not only of like Wraith Babes and stuff, but like even when like he's like like being is sitting in his room, like these ads will pop up on the screen, and in order to skip it, you have to actually pay merits.
hmm
But in order to watch, it, you have to pay merits, and so it's kind of like
did they have to did they have to pay merits to watch, or was it only if you bought the product?
I know if you buy it, you so like if you actually like bought the video or whatever, I think it's we see Bing he ends up buying one of the Wraith Babes video. It's like 10,000 merits or like whatever the heck.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But if you actually want to skip it, it's like 500 or like 1,000 or something
hmm
like that. But like if you don't, it's essentially like what would it be like? I think it'd be the equivalent of like skipping a commercial on like smart TV or something like that, or
Right,
like
but the crazy thing is you literally have to watch the ads. If you cover your eyes or look away, it starts going and sirens at you and the screens go red, so that you have to watch the particular ad. So
Mhm.
it's an interesting, situation there.
Yeah, and that's probably I would say easily the darkest part of this thing, because like what do we see happen? We see like this girl Abby, who's essentially almost kind of like she's almost like angelic and like not only like appearance but in voice, and like almost as like a symbol of hope for being like if like maybe he's probably not
Mm,
talented enough to make it on Hot Shot, but she is, and he actually gifts her the 15 million merits to try and like get her up this status. He wants her like maybe he can't escape the cycle, but he can help somebody else.
yeah.
But what happens? She just gets sucked back into the cycle and again and becomes part of the machine. And then the parts of her that he admires are like now twisted and like
Yeah, and he can't stand that emotionally, like
yeah,
watching
like
her.
he's the girl that he was essentially falling in love with, and then like she's starting to be exploited for just corporate.
And that guilt. I mean, there was that scene where he has the tattoo from when he went with her, and he's trying to stab it out with with his glass shard, trying to get it out because he doesn't want to be reminded of the fact that he was involved with getting her to that point, that he made things possibly worse for her.
Mm,
And I think you do notice that because when you watch her in the couple, I mean, they obviously don't show anything, but you sort of watch her in those Wraith Babe commercials. She doesn't look happy. You can see her, like, her glow is gone. She used
yeah.
to have a glow and a sort of sparkle in her eye when she was talking with Bing
Well,
and the like, but that was just gone. It was just glazed
even
over.
like the judge, like that his name is actually Wraith, and yeah, as like Wraith Productions or whatever, which is like the porn production part of it or whatever.
Right.
Like he's only interested in like his side of things, but he even mentioned like when they're up on stage of like, oh, like we can give you meds for that, like you're not going to worry about all this, like like there's different ways to like medicate regret away or whatever. But we also see something like that too with like the literal juice before they go up on stage for a hot shot, which is called like compliance, like clearly a play on words for compliance. Like do you think there's anything possibly in there of almost kind of like this like medication factor to try and like numb people away from like what they're actually feeling perchance?
Maybe, I mean, yes, in some sense, obviously, right? That's like a pretty overt sort of metaphor comparison there. Um, I'm not sure exactly how it factors into it because there's a lot of people who just seem to go on stage and you know just try to sing and then they don't make it or the like.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's compliance. It's making them so that then they're less, you know they don't go off too much or something like that. but it definitely plays a factor. I mean, we saw there Bing pretending like he had drank the compliance previously because he didn't want any, and
Mm,
that's what allowed him to really state his mind, to really say what was authentic, to give an authentic take.
yeah.
So it's yeah, so it's I mean it's definitely I think relevant. Yeah.
Hmm. I'm trying to think of any other. Were there any other aspects of this episode that stuck out to you, or also like was this the first time you watched it, or like the second, or
No, I mean this is the second time that I've
okay,
seen this
yeah,
episode. Yeah, so I've seen this episode before, and again, I think overall it's definitely an interesting episode, and it's the first one where we really start to see the arc of Black Mirror. I think we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but we start to see the idea of each episode being entirely distinct, but in some ways still running on the same themes. Right? We
mm,
saw this. We're seeing the same theme of technology and how our society functions, a critique of society, and each being a different scene, right? Like it's a different different cast of characters, different set of characters, but all in some sense living the same life, even though they're all living completely different lives. So I think that this episode is a good episode to kick us off when it comes to Black Mirror. It helps us understand um, understand both Black Mirror and understand how it is a criticism of contemporary life and not just a interesting and fantastical show to watch talking about, oh, this may or may not happen, because
yeah.
the argument there is no, it has already happened to our life.
Hmm. And that honestly, that's one of the scary things about Black Mirror too. Like even once we get into like some of like the future episodes and stuff, like there's already things that are happening that act like they pretty much come straight out of a Black Mirror, which is
Yeah.
like honestly like scary, but also like very poignant as well because it's like just to it just shows like the weight of the show of how much like it's almost kind of like that like fiction reflecting reality but also like inverted as well. It's almost kind of like they're tied at the hip in a sense too, so yeah. But I think this show is definitely one of my favorites, especially not even just on Netflix but almost just like overall currently it seems like, just because like it's so engaging, like you do have like the entertaining aspect of like like seeing the story arcs through the different characters, but also like even after you watch it, you're still like meditating on it and trying to like understand each episode. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've been particularly drawn to this series is that there's so much to unpack from these, and that's one of the reasons that we're trying to do that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look forward to talking about the third episode coming up hopefully next week. We'll be back to talk about that, but for now, if you like the video, appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.
All right, peace.